Today, we're going to talk about global climate, and the goal of this video is to describe the differences between weather and climate and describe some of the factors that affect global climate. So, first, what is climate? Climate is the long term average of weather in a particular location. This would include the long term average of temperature, precipitation, clouds, and wind. Weather is just the short term changes in those same factors: temperature, precipitation, clouds, and wind. So, the big difference between the two is that climate is going to remain relatively stable since it's an average of these long term conditions. And because it's fairly stable, it's easier to predict. Weather, on the other hand, is going to change more rapidly since it's a short term measurement of those factors. And since it can change rapidly, that makes the weather more unstable and harder to predict. Okay, now with the remainder of the video, we want to look at some factors that affect climate. So, what affects climate? The first is latitude. Latitude is the distance north or south of the equator. And temperature changes with latitude because at the equator, the sun's rays are most direct. And you can see that in this image here. Here's the sun, here's the earth. The sun's rays are most direct at the equator. And so the temperature is going to be highest there. But as you move to the north or the south at the poles, the sun's rays are less direct. They don't hit the earth quite directly, and that makes the temperature lowest there. So the latitude will affect the climate, and you can see the effect that latitude has by looking at these zones. So here near the equator, this is called the tropics, and there's really only two seasons in these areas. There's the wet season and the dry season. And then at the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, you the temperatures are really, really cold. So these are the Arctic and the Antarctic. And again, there's really only two seasons in those areas. There's polar days and polar nights. But in between the equator and the poles, you have the mid latitudes, and these are sometimes called the temperate zones. And this is where you see four seasons: summer, autumn, winter, and spring. Okay, so these are the zones that you get as a result of the difference in temperatures. And the differences in temperatures is the result of the changes in latitude and how directly the sun hits that part of the earth. Okay, another factor that affects climate is global winds. Global wind is wind that occurs in a belt that circles the planet. So you can see there's the westerlies, the northeast trade winds. Each of these represents a belt that circles the planet. And there's an unequal distribution of heat, like we just talked about. Near the equator, the temperature's warmer. Near the poles, the temperature's colder. So there's an unequal distribution of heat. And that unequal distribution of heat actually creates global winds. How does that work? Well, here's the gist. Hot air at the equator rises, and then it moves to the north and south and it cools down along the way. So as it moves to the north, or as that wind moves that as that air moves to the north and as it moves to the south, it cools down along the way. And when it cools, it gets heavier, and that makes it fall back down. So when it's hot, it rises, but as it cools, it falls back down. And this up and down movement makes these loops of air. In addition to that, as Earth spins, it makes wind blow from in certain directions. So the wind blows from the west to the east in the temperate zones, and it blows from the east to the west in the tropics and the poles. So you can see near the center of the Earth, near the equator, the winds both above the equator and below the equator are blowing from east to west. But as you move toward the poles, up in the temperate zones, the wind blows from the west to the east. Okay, so global winds also affect the climate. Here's another factor: ocean currents. Ocean currents affect the climate because they redistribute heat. So, warm ocean currents carry heat from the equator. Again, the equator is warm. So, ocean currents near the equator, it's going to carry heat toward the poles. And that's going to help moderate the climate of the regions that they flow through, like those temperate zones that we talked about. Now, cold ocean currents, they bring cooler temperatures with them, and you can see along these coastlines, there's going to be cooler temperatures, and that affects local climate. In addition to redistributing heat, ocean currents also transport moisture, and this is going to impact weather patterns and events like rainfall and tropical storms and hurricanes, and those are going to affect regional climate as well. Okay, another factor that affects climate is the altitude. Air temperature falls at higher altitudes because the air molecules are more spread out, they're less dense, and because of this, there are fewer collisions of molecules. And when there's fewer collisions, less heat is produced. So that's why air temperature falls at higher altitudes. And an example of this is Mount Kilimanjaro. So this is an image of Mount Kilimanjaro. You'll notice down here at the base, it looks like there's pretty warm temperatures down here. You have trees growing. It looks like a hot day there. But if you look at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, it's white. It's covered in snow. So how is that? How is it so cold at the top, yet hot at the bottom, at the base? Well, that's because of the altitude of Mount Kilimanjaro. As you ascend the mountain, the air molecules are more spread out. They're less dense. There's less collisions. So there's less heat. So that's why it gets colder. Okay, the final factor that affects climate that we're going to talk about in this video will be mountains. So mountains can affect the amount of precipitation. Mountains can affect precipitation due to a rain shadow. And here's the idea. Here's how this works. As winds rise up what's called the windward side of a mountain, the side where the wind is hitting that side, as winds rise up the windward side of the mountain, as they rise up, the air cools, again, for the same reason that we just talked about with altitude. Temperatures are cooler at the top. So as the wind rises up, the air cools, and that causes the condensation, the condensing of water vapor, and so precipitation falls. So precipitation is going to fall on the windward side of the mountain. But then on the other side of the mountain, that's called the leeward side, the air is dry. The water's already fell on the other side of the mountain. So on this side, the air is dry, and that dry air sinks, and it actually causes very little precipitation to fall on that side. So these factors are all ways that climate can be affected.